started before sunrise, and the sound rolled across Mercer Hollow Farm like a metal animal waking hungry. Caleb Mercer heard it from his back porch before he saw the lights. A low diesel cough, first, then the hard rattle of a trailer bouncing over the private drive his father had graded with a borrowed blade 20 years earlier. By the time he reached Willow Pond, the eastern gate was hanging open. The chain lay in the wet grass, and a black hose, as thick as a man's thigh, had already been dragged down the bank. The hose disappeared into the pond where the water was still dark with morning. A yellow pump shuddered on steel skids near the willows. Its engine hammered the air. The water around the intake curled inward, dragging duckweed, silt, and tiny flashes of fish toward the suction. At the far side of the fence, the unfinished streets of Silver Ridge Phase 2 climbed the slope in raw terraces of orange clay, pale sand, exposed footings, and half-poured foundations waiting for the storm that every weather channel in Texas had been talking about for 3 days. 2 sheriff's cruisers rolled in behind Caleb S. truck. County environmental vehicle followed. A water resources inspector stepped out with his shirt half-tucked and his boots unlaced. The way men looked when they had been pulled from breakfast by a call that sounded wrong before it sounded urgent. Ace Whitcomb stood beside the pump. In a cream raincoat, her hair pinned so tightly the wind could not disturb it. She had one hand pressed around a folder from the Silver Ridge Estates HOA, and the other wrapped around her phone. Grant Bell from Brightstone Development stood behind her with a site supervisor and 3 workers in reflective vests. The pump kept roaring. Caleb did not shout. He did not run at the workers, or grab the hose or point at the broken lock. He walked past the sheriff, past the churned tire tracks, and stopped at the old dock post where his father had painted a red line during the drought of 2011. That line had been a warning once. His father had painted it. After a summer so dry, the pasture cracked open and the cattle crowded the troughs before dawn. If the pond stayed above that mark, his father had told him, the farm could still make it. Below that line, they would start choosing what lived and what died. Now the water was dropping toward the red mark, not because of drought, not because of heat, not because of God or weather or bad luck, but because men with a pump and a development schedule had decided his pond could be emptied to save their foundations. Caleb watched the waterline touch the faded paint. Denise moved closer to the sheriff before Caleb could speak. Her expression carried the strain of someone who had spent months convincing herself that fear was the same thing as authority. Silver Ridge had 72 families downhill from unstable construction, she explained. Brightstone had an emergency mitigation plan. The incoming storm could send mud and runoff into occupied homes. The pond, she said, had to be lowered temporarily to protect the community. The word temporarily vanished under the sound of the pump. Caleb looked past her to the slope. He saw the truth in one glance because he had spent half his life reading land the way other men read weather. Phase 2 sat on a cut-and-fill hillside of sandy clay, not fully compacted, not fully vegetated, not ready for 4 inches of rain. The silt fence sagged in 3 places. The drainage swales were unfinished. Several house pads were still open, their footings raw, their trenches waiting to become channels. Brightstone was not protecting homes. Brightstone was trying to turn Willow Pond into a sediment trap. They wanted the water sucked down low enough that when the storm hit, the pond would become a giant pocket for their mud, clay wash, construction runoff, and broken slope. Caleb S. Pond would save their 68 lots by swallowing the failure they had built uphill. By morning, if they got their way, Willow Pond would not be a farm pond anymore. It would be a brown pit full of construction sludge, dead fish, clogged irrigation lines, and whatever washed off Brightstone's exposed site. The sheriff asked Caleb whether he had paperwork. Caleb opened the back of his truck and lifted out 3 binders, a rolled survey, a plastic evidence case, and one Eld County file whose edges had yellowed before Denise Whitcomb was born. I set them on the hood of the cruiser. The metal was cold and slick beneath his fingers. The pump pulled the pond below the red line. Caleb laid the first document flat. On the page was a county stamp from 1954, a hand-drawn basin marked Willow Pond, and a notation that had survived 7 decades in archive dust because his grandfather had understood what water meant, before anyone at Brightstone understood what a premium lot was worth. Senior Agricultural Water Right, Mercer Parcel, Willow Branch Watershed. The Water Resources Inspector leaned closer. Denise stopped recording. 3 months earlier, Willow Pond had been quiet enough to hear acorns fall into it. Caleb had lived with that sound all his life. At 46, he knew the farm by noises, more than measurements. The sigh of the old windmill when the bearings needed grease, the hollow bang of a loose barn door before a north wind, soft clicking of peach branches rubbing together at dawn, the drip of irrigation valves under pressure, the frogs that started calling from the cattails before rain moved in from the west. Mercer Hollow Farm was 83 acres on the edge of a town that no longer believed in edges. Every year, another pasture became a subdivision. Every month, another sign promised gated living, hill country views, community trails, and natural amenities. Caleb had watched asphalt crawl toward his fences until the nights no longer went fully dark. His grandfather had bought the first piece of land after coming home from Korea. His father had added the hayfield, built the barn, planted the second row of peaches, and painted every gate a shade of green nobody sold anymore. Caleb had left a county engineering job to care for him during the cancer years and never gone back. Told people the farm needed him. The truth was simpler and harder. After his father died, the farm was the only place where Caleb still knew what to do with his hands. Willow Pond sat in a natural bowl below the eastern pasture, fed by shallow groundwater, seep, and a seasonal branch that ran after heavy rain. Caleb's grandfather had deepened it in the early 1950s with a borrowed dozer and neighbors who traded labor for future favors. The pond watered the orchard through buried pipe, filled cattle troughs during dry weeks, and held enough reserve that the local volunteer fire department had once drafted from it when lightning hit a hay barn 2 properties over. It was not decorative. It was not common open space. It was the heart of a working farm. Caleb had learned to fish on the old dock while his father drank black coffee from a thermos and said very little. He had learned to read drought by the smell of the mud and rain, by the way turtles left the bank. During the brutal summer of 2011, when stock tanks across the county turned to cracked bowls, his father painted the red mark on the dock post and checked it every morning as if it were a pulse. The pond never dropped below it that year. Caleb remembered that more clearly than he remembered Christmas. Silver Ridge Estates appeared beyond the east fence 2 years after the funeral. At first, Caleb tried not to resent it. People needed homes. Land changed. He knew that better than most because he had spent years reviewing drainage plans for the county. He understood culverts, detention basins, erosion control, easements, floodplain maps, and the polite little lies that could hide inside engineering language. He also understood that bad water planning always became someone else's problem downhill. Phase 1 of Silver Ridge was already built when Denise Whitcomb became HOA president. She was not stupid. That was the thing Caleb noticed from the start. She had bought into the first phase when Silver Ridge was still a promise and had built her reputation on protecting it. She organized landscaping committees, pushed Brightstone to finish the entrance monuments, fought over mailbox lighting, and made sure every newsletter mentioned property values at least twice. People trusted her because she sounded like someone who knew where the danger was. In some ways, she did. Her house sat near the low end of Phase 1. Close enough to the unfinished slope of Phase 2 that a hard rain could send runoff through backyards before anyone at Brightstone answered a phone. She had pushed the developer for months to stabilize the new construction. Brightstone had responded with timelines, assurances, engineering attachments, and just enough delay to keep the HOA from revolting. Then Denise found a simpler target. Caleb met her on a windy February afternoon while he was replacing an irrigation coupling near the barn. A white SUV came down his drive without an appointment. A black Brightstone pickup followed. Annie Nice stepped out first, dressed for a board meeting rather than a farm, and Grant Bell unfolded a drainage exhibit across the hood of his truck. They wanted a temporary drainage partnership. The phrase sounded clean, almost neighborly. Brightstone needed to route stormwater from Phase 2 into an existing water feature adjacent to Silver Ridge. The connection would be controlled. The arrangement could include maintenance, beautification, and possibly compensation. The HOA supported the plan because it would protect residents, enhance the natural corridor, and avoid unnecessary duplication of infrastructure. Caleb stood with a wrench in his hand and studied the arrows. Every blue line on the map pointed into Willow Pond. The pond was labeled Existing Shared Drainage Basin. That was not a mistake a drainage engineer made by accident. It was a choice, a soft phrase placed where a legal right should have been. Caleb told them the pond was private agricultural infrastructure. It served irrigation, livestock, and fire protection. It belonged to Mercer Hollow Farm. It had never been dedicated to Silver Ridge, Brightstone, or any HOA. Any formal proposal could be sent to his attorney with hydrology calculations, ownership basis, easement claims, and environmental analysis. Denise S.'s smile did not disappear. It hardened. Her fear was there, buried under polish. Caleb saw it later, though he did not understand it fully in that moment. She was afraid of the slope, afraid of angry residents, afraid that Brightstone would leave the HOA holding maintenance bills and lawsuits if the first big storm exposed Phase 2 as unfinished. But fear did not make her humble. It made her certain she could not afford to lose. Within a week, the first notice arrived. Silver Ridge Estates HOAs accused Caleb of maintaining stagnant nuisance water along the community boundary. The letter mentioned mosquitoes, odor, runoff obstruction, and aesthetic blight. It demanded that Willow Pond be brought into compliance with community water feature standards and warned that daily fines could be assessed if the nuisance affected residents. Caleb read the letter at his kitchen table while rain tapped softly on the window over the sink. He was not a member of the HOA. His land was outside its covenants. The pond predated the subdivision by decades. He responded by certified mail, firmly but calmly, stating that the HOA had no jurisdiction over Mercer Hollow Farm and that Willow Pond was a private agricultural pond. He attached only the basic tax map and deed page, enough to establish boundaries, not enough to reveal his whole hand. Denise did not retreat. She shifted arenas. Residents began filing mosquito complaints with the county health department. The wording was too similar to be accidental. Stagnant water near residences. Unsafe pond. Suspected odor. Children at risk. Within 2 weeks, a county health inspector came to the farm. He was not hostile, only overworked. He walked the fence line, looked at the pond from the bank, checked for obvious algae bloom, and admitted that a farm pond was not automatically a nuisance because it had frogs and reeds. His report was cautious, which made it dangerous. No immediate violation observed, but continued monitoring recommended due to proximity of residential development. Denise used that sentence like a weapon. Silver Ridge emails began describing Willow Pond as a monitored nuisance site. A newsletter warned residents that the HOA was actively pursuing remedies to address water hazards near the eastern boundary. Posts appeared in the neighborhood group. Some were worried, some were cruel. One called Caleb, a holdout farmer, endangering children because he wanted a payday. Caleb did not answer online. He had learned in county work that public anger was a poor place to explain private rights. He saved screenshots instead. The next move came from Brightstone. Grant Bell sent a technical memorandum with enough engineering language to frighten anyone who did not know what it meant. Phase 2 soils were described as moisture-sensitive sandy clay with moderate erosion potential. Several pads were awaiting final compaction. Temporary swales had limited capacity before permanent storm infrastructure was complete, if extraordinary rain occurred before stabilization. Sediment migration and slope instability could affect developed areas. The memo placed the burden carefully without stating it directly. If Caleb refused to allow emergency drainage accommodation, downstream impacts could worsen. Caleb read the report twice. Then he walked the fence and looked at the exposed hillside. The memo was not wrong about the risk. That made it worse. Brightstone knew its slope was vulnerable. It knew the foundations and streets were not ready. It knew its temporary erosion controls were thin theater against a real storm. And instead of slowing construction or sacrificing lots for a proper retention basin, it wanted Willow Pond available as a mud catch. A week later, orange survey flags appeared near the eastern bank. No one came to the door. No one asked permission. Caleb found the flags at sunrise, bright against the damp grass, marking a line from the Silver Ridge boundary to the pond intake. One stake had been driven so close to the buried irrigation pipe that another inch would have cracked the coupling. He did not call the sheriff. That restraint cost him something. His first instinct was anger, sharp enough to move his feet toward the phone. But anger would create another civil report, another vague note, another chance for Denise to claim he was unstable. Caleb pulled the stakes, photographed them beside a tape measure, marked the GPS coordinates, and put them in the equipment shed. That afternoon, he bought 3 cameras. One went in the barn window, aimed at the east gate. One went on a cedar post near the old tool shed. The third he tucked inside a birdhouse his father had built from scrap pine, pointed toward the pond bank. He set the recordings to back up automatically and began keeping a log in a spiral notebook. He also called Mariah Ellison. Mariah was a licensed surveyor who had worked with Caleb during his county years. She had a habit of chewing cinnamon gum when she concentrated and no patience for developers who treated boundary lines like suggestions. 2 days later, she came out with an assistant, a total station, old plats, and a field book, stiff with use. She found the first iron pin near the southern corner in 10 minutes. The second took an hour. The third was buried under grass near the spillway. An old piece of metal Caleb had walked past for years without recognizing. Maria cleaned it with her boot, checked it against the 1954 reference, and looked toward the pond with the expression of someone watching a story sharpen. The pond structure had been recorded, not implied, not informal. Recorded. Maria's survey showed the Brightstone flags had been placed 26 feet inside Mercer land. More importantly, the old iron pin tied the pond and spillway to the original agricultural impoundment. The feature Brightstone called shared drainage was not an unnamed puddle on a modern aerial map. It was an old, documented farm water structure. Caleb S. attorney, Evelyn Price, did not get excited when he brought her the first folder. That was why he trusted her. She had silver hair, blunt glasses, and the professional habit of removing hope from a room until only facts remained. She told Caleb ownership was strong, but not enough. He needed the water records, proof of active agricultural use, evidence of attempted encroachment, and proof that Brightstone knew or should have known Willow Pond was not available. So Caleb went to the county archives. A public terminal gave him modern deeds, plats, tax maps, and subdivision filings. Useful, but too clean. Modern records were often polished until history became a footnote. Caleb requested drainage books, agricultural impoundment files, water use indexes, and archived permit references tied to Willow Branch. The file he needed had not been digitized. It took 4 days to retrieve from off-site storage. The box arrived on a Thursday morning, smelling of dust, cardboard, and old glue. Caleb opened it at a side table under fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. Inside were folded plats, inspection notes, a soil conservation letter, and a permit application signed by his grandfather in blue ink, May 17, 1954. The document did more than authorize a pond. It recognized an agricultural impoundment tied to Mercer S. Use of Willow Branch runoff in shallow groundwater, seep. The county engineer S. notation classified the use as a senior or agricultural water, right attached to the parcel, dating later subdivision drainage claims in the watershed. Caleb sat back and let the words settle. Senior water right. In Texas, water law could be a thicket of surface water rules. Groundwater doctrines, riparian history, appropriative rights, drainage obligations, and local records layered across decades. The phrase did not mean the Mercers owned every drop that ever crossed the land. It did not let Caleb flood a neighbor or block lawful downstream flow, but in a dispute over who could alter, drain, or repurpose that impoundment, seniority mattered. His grandfather's right came first. Anything Brightstone claimed came later. A junior drainage claim could not erase a senior agricultural water right, simply because a subdivision wanted cheaper stormwater storage. Caleb requested certified copies and kept digging. Brightstone's public filing contained the next piece. In its Phase 2 drainage report, Willow Pond was described as an existing shared drainage basin historically serving the western watershed edge. The report never named Mercer Hollow Farm. It never disclosed the 1954 senior water record. It never included a drainage easement. The property line was faint beneath contour markings, as if the boundary had been turned down like background noise. The geotechnical appendix was more revealing. Sandy clay with variable compaction, moderate to high erosion susceptibility during exposed construction phases. Temporary controls must be maintained until permanent detention is operational. Sediment discharge risk increases significantly under high-intensity rainfall. Caleb knew what that meant in plain language. If the storm came before Brightstone finished real drainage, the hill could bleed. He found the motive in an email attached to a public comment response. Grant Bell had written to Denise and two Brightstone managers that the Mercer Pond remained the most efficient temporary sediment and stormwater accommodation. He warned that constructing an independent basin before vertical progress would remove 4 premium lots and delay Phase 2. He added that HOA pressure may encourage cooperation without triggering a formal condemnation process. Caleb printed the email and sat with it for a long time. The phrase that stayed with him was not premium lots. It was sediment accommodation. They had a cleaner name for ruining his pond. Evelyn sent a preservation letter the next morning. It required Silver Ridge and Brightstone to retain all emails, board minutes, engineering drafts, contractor instructions, access notes, and communications concerning Mercer Hollow, Willow Pond, drainage, nuisance complaints, and storm preparation. She sent a cease and desist letter as well, warning against entry, alteration, pumping, discharge, or survey activity on Caleb's land. Denise answered publicly instead of legally at a packed HOA meeting in the Silver Ridge clubhouse. She stood before the fireplace and told residents that their board was working tirelessly to protect homes from a known drainage hazard. Caleb did not attend, but a resident who had grown uncomfortable with the tone sent him the recording. Denise's voice held steady, but Caleb could hear the pressure beneath it. She was not performing, only cruelty. She was defending the version of herself the neighborhood had elected, a competent protector, the woman who never let developers push residents around. The tragedy was that Brightstone had pushed her anyway. It had pushed her until she chose the easier opponent. On the recording, she described Caleb as unwilling to participate in a reasonable safety solution. She referenced county monitoring, resident complaints, and expert reports. She said the HOA would not allow one private owner to endanger families. The applause was loud. Caleb turned off the recording before it ended. That night, he walked to Willow Pond with a flashlight. The beam crossed the dock post and caught the red mark from 2011. Paint had faded to the color of dried blood. His father had once called it the last line, not the low water line, not the drought mark, the last line. A person could lose pasture and still rebuild. Lose a crop and plant again, lose money and earn some back. But if the pond fell below that line, the farm stopped being resilient and started becoming vulnerable. Caleb touched the post with his thumb and felt the rough paint under his skin. And he went back to the house and built the case as if he were designing drainage for a courtroom. He organized the binders by failure point. The first binder-proved place: deed, survey, iron pins, tax records, agricultural valuation, and Maria stamped boundary map. The second proved water, The 1954 Senior Agricultural Water Right Willow Branch Watershed Notes, irrigation schematics, trough supply lines, fire drafting history, and pond level logs. The third proved conduct. Nuisance letters from the HOA, copied resident complaints, Brightstone S technical memo, the geotechnical report, screenshots, survey stake photos, camera clips, and Grant Bell S sediment accommodation email. He did not know when he would need all of it, the weather decided. In early May, forecasts began showing a slow storm system gathering over central Texas. The numbers changed every few hours, but the message did not. Heavy rainfall, saturated ground, localized flooding possible, high-intensity bands likely. Caleb watched the clouds build over 2 days. On the Silver Ridge slope, Brightstone crews worked late. Lights glowed over the unfinished pads. A silt fence went up in a hurry. Hay bales appeared along a swale too shallow to hold real runoff. A skid steer moved clay from one side of the site to another without solving anything. The hill looked less like a neighborhood and more like a wound waiting for rain. At 5:18 Monday morning, Caleb's phone buzzed. The barn camera showed headlights at the east gate. At 5:24, a worker cut the chain. At 5:31, a pump trailer rolled onto Mercer land. At 5:40, Caleb called Sheriff Harlan for the first time in the entire dispute. Then he called the county environmental office. The water resources inspector Evelyn had already briefed, and Evelyn herself. He loaded the binders, survey tube, archive file, and a hard drive into his truck. By the time he reached the pond, the hose was already in the water. The pump started with a violent shudder. Denise arrived minutes later. Grant Bell came behind her, his face tight with the calculation of a man who had decided a fine might be cheaper than a redesign. The site supervisor kept checking the sky. Workers avoided looking at the broken chain. Denise tried to frame the scene before anyone else could name it. Emergency mitigation, imminent storm threat, protection of residents, temporary lowering, existing drainage accommodation, public safety. Caleb stood at the dock post and watched the pond fall. When Sheriff Harlan arrived, Caleb did not argue with Denise. He did not debate resident safety. He asked the sheriff, the environmental inspector, and the water resources inspector to look at the pump intake, broken lock, the unfinished Silver Ridge slope, and the red mark on the dock post. Then he opened the binders. He started with the survey. Maria's stamped map placed Willow Pond entirely inside Mercer Hollow Farm. The old iron pin near the spillway matched the recorded agricultural impoundment. The Brightstone access route crossed private land without easement. Grant said something about field assumptions. Caleb turned to the water file. The 1954 certified record lay flat on the cruiser hood. The water resources inspector read the phrase "Senior Agricultural Water" right twice. Caleb watched the Inspector S expression change from sleepy irritation to professional alarm. He explained that Brightstone S plan treated Willow Pond as a junior convenience when the Mercer right predated the subdivision S existence. No recorded easement, no discharge agreement, no water rights analysis, no authority to lower the pond. Denise's hand tightened around her folder. The pump kept pulling. Caleb opened the geotechnical appendix. He showed the sandy clay, incomplete compaction, exposed pads, and sediment risk. He placed beside it Grant Bell S email calling Willow Pond the most efficient sediment and stormwater accommodation. Then, he showed the construction layout where the proper retention basin would have taken 4 premium lots. The environmental inspector looked from the document to the slope. The selfishness of it was suddenly visible. Brightstone was not merely borrowing storage. It was exporting failure. It wanted Caleb S. water body emptied so its mud could land somewhere cheaper than its own balance sheet. Caleb played the camera clips last. Headlights at the gate, the worker cutting the chain, the pump trailer entering before sunrise. Previous clips of surveyors placing flags inside the boundary. Denise and Grant walking the fence line weeks earlier, pointing toward the pond bank. The timestamps were clear. The property line was marked. The letters had warned them. Sheriff Harlan asked who ordered the lock cut. For the first time, That morning, the pump was the only thing answering. The water resources inspector ordered it shut down. The site supervisor hesitated and looked at Grant. The inspector repeated the order with a voice flat enough to make everyone understand. The next step would not be a request. The worker killed the engine. Silence fell so suddenly that the pond seemed to ring. Water glugged backward through the hose. Mud slid off the intake. Somewhere in the exposed roots of the willow trees, frogs started up again. Tentative at first, then louder, the red mark on the dock post sat above the lowered water line. Fully exposed now, as if the drought of 2011 had been dragged back into daylight and made to testify. Denise tried to speak. Her voice did not have its usual polish, she said. The HOA had relied on Brightstone S engineers. She said residents were scared. She said she had acted to protect families. It was not entirely false, and that made it sadder. She had been afraid. She had been pressured. She had seen a threat coming down the hill and chosen to push the cost through a fence onto a man she thought could be isolated. Grant tried to call the situation a misunderstanding. The inspectors did not treat it like one. By noon, the county issued a stop work order on all drainage-related activity affecting the western edge of Silver Ridge, Phase 2. The Environmental Office opened a review of unauthorized land disturbance and potential sediment discharge planning. Water Resources began a formal inquiry into Brightstone S' failure to disclose the senior Mercer water right. Sheriff Harlan documented trespass and criminal mischief for the cut lock, pump entry, and prior service intrusions. The storm arrived that night. Rain hit the farmhouse roof with a steady, finishing roar. Caleb barely slept. He walked to the porch again and again, watching sheets of water turn the yard silver. Beyond the east fence, Brightstone S slope bled orange into temporary swales that strained and overflowed. But with the pumps stopped and emergency barriers ordered into place by the county, the worst of the sediment stayed on Brightstone land, where it should have been managed from the start. Willow Pond rose through the night, not cleanly. Mud washed in from natural runoff. The bank was scarred where the hose had been, but it did not become the sacrifice Pitt Brightstone had planned. 2 weeks later, the county review hearing filled beyond its usual attendance. Brightstone came with engineers, counsel, and revised language. Silver Ridge came with board members and anxious residents. Denise sat near the front, smaller somehow, without the clubhouse fireplace behind her. Caleb came with Evelyn, Maria, certified records, water logs, camera footage, and quiet neighbors who had begun to understand that if a developer could rename one old pond, it could rename anything. The hearing room smelled of damp jackets and burnt coffee. Brightstone's engineer tried to explain the report as preliminary coordination language. The county reviewer asked for the recorded easement allowing discharge into Willow Pond. There was none. He asked for the agreement with Mercer Hollow Farm. There was none. He asked for the water rights analysis, addressing the 1954 senior agricultural right. There was none. Evelyn did not dramatize. She did not need to. She laid out the sequence. Brightstone knew its Phase 2 slope was vulnerable. Brightstone knew an independent basin would cost lots and time. Brightstone labeled a private senior right agricultural pond as shared drainage. The HOA amplified nuisance complaints and public pressure when the storm came. Contractors entered Mercer land before sunrise and began lowering the pond to create sediment capacity without consent. Each document struck a different support beam. The survey destroyed the shared basin claim. The 1954 record destroyed the assumption that later development rights could outrank Mercer as use. The geotechnical report destroyed the idea that this was about natural drainage rather than construction risk. The email destroyed the claim that no one understood the pond would be used as sediment storage. The camera footage destroyed the word misunderstanding. Residents began whispering before the reviewer finished. A Silver Ridge board member stared at Denise with the stunned anger of a man realizing he had defended a story he had never fully been told. Another resident stood in the back with arms crossed tight over her chest, her face changing As the financial implications became clear, the county suspended Brightstone's Phase 2 drainage approval. No discharge, pumping, sediment routing, grading, reliance, disaster, or emergency storage plan could involve Willow Pond without a recorded agreement, senior water rights review, environmental clearance, and new public approval. Brightstone would have to redesign the system entirely on land it owned. The retention basin it had avoided would have to be built inside Phase 2. 4 premium lots disappeared from the plan. So did the schedule. The entrance road had to shift. The slope had to be stabilized before vertical construction continued. New calculations were required. Additional erosion controls were mandated. Brightstone's $1 million shortcut became an expensive public failure. Denise lasted 6 more days as HOA president. At the Silver Ridge meeting that removed her was louder than any meeting Caleb had ever attended, though he heard about it secondhand. Residents were angry about legal spending, angry about undisclosed risk, angry that HOA authority had been used as cover for developer convenience. Some still believed Denise had tried to protect them. Others believed that was exactly the problem. She had protected them by pretending someone else, as land was available, for sacrifice. She resigned before the recall vote finished. There was no cartoon collapse, no screaming exit, no dramatic confession. Just a woman who had mistaken control for leadership walking out of a clubhouse, while the people who once applauded her studied the floor. Brightstone settled with Caleb in July. The amount was not outrageous. It did not make him rich, and it did not erase what had happened. It covered the broken gates, survey costs, legal fees, water testing, pond bank restoration, irrigation repairs, fish loss, and installation of a stronger east fence. Silver Ridge withdrew every nuisance claim and sent a written acknowledgement that Willow Pond was private property outside HOA control. Brightstone corrected its public filings and paid county penalties tied to deficient drainage disclosures and unauthorized site activity. Phase 2 did not vanish. It shrank. The big retention basin went exactly where 4 expensive homes were supposed to stand. For months, every time Caleb drove past the construction entrance, he saw machines digging the pond Brightstone had tried to outsource to him. The sight did not make him happy. Exactly. Satisfaction was too clean a word. It made him feel that gravity had finally remembered where to place the weight. Willow Pond healed slowly. The pump scar stayed visible through summer, a raw bite in the bank where grass would not take at first. Caleb reseeded it twice. The irrigation intake clogged with silt during a hot week in August, and he spent an afternoon waist-deep in muddy water, clearing it by hand. The fish population dipped. The water tests came back below major enforcement thresholds, but high enough to remind him that legal victory did not filter a pond overnight. The worst damage was quieter. For months, strangers had known him as the man with the mosquitoes swamp. Some Silver Ridge residents avoided his eyes at the feed store. A few apologized. One young couple came by with their son and admitted they had believed the HOA emails until the hearing. Caleb accepted the apology because he had learned that refusing every olive branch was another way of letting Denise keep control of his life. By October, the willows had begun to hold the bank again. Their roots had been exposed when the pump dragged the water down, long, dark fingers gripping mud beneath the torn edge. For weeks, they looked wounded, almost skeletal. Then new shoots appeared around them. Fine roots threaded into the restored soil. Grass returned in patches. Frogs hid beneath the shade, and dragonflies stitched blue lines over the surface in the evenings. One morning, Caleb carried coffee to the dock before sunrise. The air smelled of wet cedar, cold mud, and the faint sweetness of fallen peaches rotting under the last row of trees. Silver Ridge was quiet beyond the fence. Its new retention basin held rainwater inside its own boundary, exactly where it should have been from the beginning. Caleb stopped at the dock post. A red line from 2011 was still there, faded but visible. The water had risen almost to it, high enough that the reflection blurred the paint. He thought of his father's hand, holding the brush that summer, the way he had marked the last line, not as surrender, but as a promise to pay attention before it was too late. Drought had once tested that line. Greed had crossed it. Now the pond was climbing back. Caleb scattered feed across the surface and watched small fish break through in quick silver flashes. The willow roots gripped the bank below him, mostly hidden again, doing their work in the dark. He thought about old records in courthouse boxes, iron pins under grass, water rights buried in language no one bothered to read, and family roots that only looked fragile to people who never had to depend on them. That willow pond was not large. It would never appear in a brochure, except as scenery someone else wanted to claim. It was just a farm pond under a stand of willows, with a crooked dock, a faded red mark, and water that knew the shape of the land better than any development map. But it had held through drought. It had held through pressure. It had held when men came before sunrise with a pump and a plan. Caleb stayed until the sun cleared the pasture fence and lit the pond gold. Then he turned back toward the farmhouse, leaving the water behind him to settle, root by root, inch by inch, into the place where it had always belonged.